Yeah, thank you very much, Greta, and thank you very much for inviting me, having the honor here to introduce some of our colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to present you the first speaker today, somebody you probably will know very well. I know him very well. It's Till-Holger Borchert from the Groningen Museum in Bruges. Till is working at the museum since more than 15 years. I remember one of his large exhibitions in 2002, Jan van Eyck and the South, and some of you might have seen that show, which already included some of the major and master works that will be mentioned in his talk, I'm pretty sure. And since 2014, he is director of the Groningen Museum in Bruges. And he is a specialist, of course, on early Netherlandish art, and his special fields of interest are Memling, and he started with Memling, working on him quite a long time. And in recent years, he has focused more or less on Jan van Eyck, but also on quite a lot of other early Netherlandish painters. And well, Jan van Eyck and the South was one of his many exhibitions. There were quite a lot more. For example, in 2010, the exhibition From van Eyck to Dürer, Netherlandish masters and painters in the East. But, okay, time is running. Till, would you like to come up here?
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Stephan. I'm not used to having people announce my name without any accent, so thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to be here today at this conference dedicated to Tallinn's most famous early Netherlandish artist, Michel Sittow. For me, the fact that we are gathered here today on the occasion of a monographical exhibition on the artist is, in fact, a small miracle. Thanks to the ambition, enthusiasm, and persistence of our dear colleagues from the Estonian Art Museum, who took the initiative for this remarkable show, the prospect to study, compare, and to reassess the oeuvre of this finessing painter. Not the least of the success was based on the fact that they managed to ignite the interest of the National Gallery in Washington in the person of John Oliver Hand, who staged the exhibition earlier this year and thereby offered a small cultural gem to the American public instead of another blockbuster on, say, Vermeer. I had the welcome opportunity to visit the show in Washington in January, which was beautifully installed and by way of objects exceeded my wildest expectations. As art historians working in the field of Northern Renaissance art, we ought to be extremely grateful for the unique opportunity that carefully prepared exhibitions like this one provide, and to cherish the collateral benefits that come along in the form of further research and, perhaps even more importantly, the occasional conservation of artworks with the additional knowledge gained during the restoration process. One of the aspects that this exhibition demonstrates is the paramount role of portraiture within the production and throughout the career of Michel Sittow, and it is this aspect that I would like to concentrate on. Michel Sittow emerges as a remarkable portrait painter who, despite his limited oeuvre, occupies an important position in the history of Flemish portraiture. The portrait of a man traditionally known as Diego de Guevara, and we will hear more about his identity later today, is among the most intense likenesses of the period and is perhaps Sittow's masterpiece. Three other portraits shown here in Tallinn in the Kunstimuuseum are generally accepted as autographs work, and they display Sittow's range as a portraitist. They display subtle variations of style, size, and function. I was able to include two of the portraits in an exhibition in Bruges in 2002, as Stephan mentioned, namely this gentleman here and this gentleman, and was struck even then by the strong physical presence that they had among other portraits of the period. We will return to these panels and examine them in the context of portraiture in a bit. Let's begin with the Washington portrait. Here, the great painterly skills are merged with a superb sense for composition and light. The naturalism in depicting the material world, the rendering of the fur, collar, the brocade, the carpet, defines the social status of the sitter. The material aspect of the portrait complemented by the expressive character of the likeness that points to an emphatic sensibility on the part of its creator. Sitter is able to imagine or to capture his sitter's introspective state by displaying an introverted face that is neither engaged nor interacting with the Virgin and Child on the left. Sitter's work is, of course, part of a devotional diptych and thereby part of a distinctively Franco-Flemish tradition of devotional images or images of devotion that became increasingly popular in the Low Countries during the second half of the 15th century. The diptych of Martin van Nieuwenhove, which I show you here, painted by Hans Memling for a member of a prominent family of politicians in Bruges, is a good example for the type of devotional portrait diptych that Sittow must have been well aware of, and that provided a sort of matrix for both him and his client. A few years ago, the Lübeck Museum acquired a devotional diptych by Henning an der Heiden, well known here in Tallinn, that followed the well-established patterns of Netherlandish portrait triptychs as well, and shows that the format or type was well known in the Baltic as well. The invention, if you want to call it that way, of the devotional portrait diptych is usually accredited to Rogier van der Weyden. Regardless if this is true or not, there can be little doubt that the combination of half-length Virgin and Child with representation of one or more devout sitters helped shape this particular genre of painting in the Burgundian Netherlands. I show here the well-known diptych of the Burgundian courtier Philippe de Croix, now divided between the Huntington Library in San Marino and the Royal Museum in Antwerp, although I have to admit I'm not quite sure. My colleagues are lending all over the work where it is right now. The diptych is a typical example for the initial popularity of the image type within the Burgundian court, which, without doubt, had a major impact on the patronage of bourgeois elites who resided in the urban centers of the Low Countries. This, of course, also included foreigners who, like merchants from Florence and Germany, commissioned this type of devotional portraits to satisfy their own devotional needs and, as I have argued elsewhere, with the prospect of imposing status to the place of their origins when re-importing the works back to their hometowns. It should be remembered that devotional presentation existed before van der Weyden in Franco-Flemish art, and that the half-length type that emerged around the 15th century was closer related to venerated Byzantine images on one hand side and less ambivalent on a formal level on the other. The small scale certainly was an advantage, but doesn't really explain the type, since, as demonstrated by these famous miniatures from the so-called Brussels hours of Jean de Berry, it would have been entirely possible to compress a different type of image into a smaller format that could be transportable. A point in case is Jan van Eyck's Virgin of the Burgundian Chancellor Nicolas Rolin, presumably made for his family chapel in Autun. Like Rogier's diptych and the opening miniature of Jean de Berry, it represents the praying donor opposite the Virgin and Child. The essential ingredients of the devotional portrait diptych are present, but the arrangements of the figures are reminiscent of epitaphs. Arguable, Van Eyck's panel frames the essential figures with a vast array of details in both an interior and panoramic landscape that offers vast distraction to the eye. The diptych of Martin van Nieuwenhove, however, cannot necessarily be seen as an example for visual sobriety either, despite the fact that Memling's highly original interpretation of the devotional portrait diptych is essentially based on a made-to-measure adaptation of what must have been a standard pattern. The diptych includes emblematic allusions to the name and the status of the sitter. For example, here the name saint appears here. We have the coat of arms and a few emblematic glass roundels that allude to the name Van Nieuwenhove, the new farmer place. The definition of space is, in this instance, absolutely essential for the understanding of the diptych, as the Virgin and Child share the same space with the devout donor Martin van Nieuwenhove. Sittow stripped his image from the visually distracting elements and concentrated his depiction on the essentials. The dark background, a reminiscence on early Flemish portraitures before 1450, enhances the physical presence of the figures, while the parapet with the conspicuously displayed Turkish rug unites the pictorial space on the one hand side and seems to present a physical barrier towards the space of the beholder. At least it does so at first sight. A second look reveals that Sittow arranged the space in an ambivalent way as well, with different and simpler means than Memling did in his diptych of Martin van Nieuwenhove. Sittow ensures that the space of the sitter can be perceived as being that of the beholder, since the parapet, in contrast to Memling, doesn't run through the entire image, it actually stops here. The position of the devout donor therefore becomes transitory, as he is shown to be able to move into the divine space and out. Sittow subtly transformed the traditional typology of the devotional portrait diptych, while the infant performs a conventional gesture touching the Virgin's shin, which we know from many Italo-Byzantine and then later also Flemish examples. Its articulate body and twisted legs are indicative of a sophisticated courtly taste of the Habsburg Netherlands, for which I show on the right a little-known example by Jan Gossard, recently, I believe, acquired by the Duke of Liechtenstein. The portrait itself is far more conventional, and its clear focus on realism seems to look back beyond Memling. Even when we set aside for a moment Memling's portrait of Martin van Nieuwenhove and compare Sittow's image to the portrait of Gilles Joie, painted by Memling in 1472, it is clear that his interest in the splendor of realism is quite different than Memling's sober representation. But the comparison can help us to understand an idiosyncratic feature of Sittow's portrait. I have mentioned that Sittow captures the introspective state of mind of the sitter by displaying an introvert face and sort of denying a clear interaction towards the Virgin. But there is more. The sitter's gesture complementing the facial expression is revealing. It isn't the image of a praying devotee, since the gesture performed by his right hand here, taking it towards his torso and subtly pointing to his heart, could be read as a greeting. The direction of his eyes suggests, however, a different reading. Does the sitter pledges himself to the Virgin and Child, and in exchange for us? Is this devotional portrait diptych in fact a votive image? I think needs to be asked. We will, of course, never know for sure, but it should be noted that this very gesture reappears a decade later so in seemingly independent portraits by Jos van Cleve in Paris and Nantes, and again in the context of a diptych in a beautiful portrait of a man in front of a vast landscape by Jan van Squirrel, which, of course, Stephan, you know very well, because it's in Berlin. Let us now turn to the second portrait that I want to discuss. It differed quite substantially from the panel in Washington, and to my mind there is little doubt about the fact that both portraits operate within different standards of decorum. Not only is the panel from the Detroit Institute of Arts much smaller, it also seems to have had a different function and was, judging from the sitter's far rather inconspicuous dress, made for someone of a lower social standing. The attribution to Sittow has been based on the remarkable quality of the panel and, to some degrees, on similarities of style, such as the pronounced modeling of the face and the subtle glazes of white that enhance the plasticity of the features, such as the nose. The sitter's gaze out of the picture has been one of the arguments to suggest that this little portrait may be a self-portrait of the artist. The same is true for the red cap, which is featured and that can be linked to the iconography of the painter's patron, Saint Luke, although I should stress not exclusively. Together with the extremely focused representation, we find both features also in Jan van Eyck's London portrait of a man with a red turban of 1433, often believed to be a self-portrait. Whereas the red chaperon is quite originally draped in van Eyck's panel, in Sittow's painting the red cap becomes one of the more disturbing features, in fact, of the portrait. The little red riding hook took, in fact, more the shape of a little red pancake, but then again the head was altered. The entire picture is focused on the likeness on the sitter. Even the hands have been omitted. Based on the asymmetrical collar that is open on the left, the likeness has an informal air to it that would seem to support the tentative identification as a possible self-portrait. As said before, this hypothesis is difficult to prove. On the other hand, the informal aspect needs to be addressed from within the concept of decorum if an alternative identification is considered. This becomes clear if we contrast the portrait with Memling's portrait of a man holding a chain from Windsor Castle, which display a similar focus on a sitter. In fact, the inclusion of Memling's Washington man with an arrow in the exhibition and in the catalogue is quite useful because it gives us an idea about possible artistic tradition that Sittow encountered during his stay in Bruges. The attire of the unknown man, who in all likelihood was a member of the confraternity/guild of Saint Sebastian in Bruges, is of an equal social standing, and quite likely both artists represented the same kind of cloth. As far as the gaze towards the viewer is concerned, always an argument for a self-portrait, but hardly a rare feature in 15th century portraiture. One might think of Memling's portrait of a Venetian ambassador, Bernardo Bembo, despite the fact that this portrait, unlike Sittow's panels, features a vast landscape background. As it is well known, landscapes were only introduced into portraiture during the second half of the 15th century. This feature becomes particularly popular among Italian patrons in the Netherlands. While Memling was perhaps the most successful artist in order to market this fashionable new type of portraits towards his affluent international clientele in Bruges, it is generally believed that it was Dirk Bautz who introduced a window with a view onto a landscape in his 1462 portrait of a scholar, now in the National Gallery in London. There is little to support such arguments, and if only because the scarcity of surviving examples doesn't allow that, and also in our context, that's actually beside the point, as there is little influence of a direct influence from Bautz on Sittow. This is much different with an artist like Memling, whose work must have best been well known to Sittow and whose compositions clearly inspired his own work. Within Memling's oeuvre as a portraitist, the small portrait of a young Venetian from the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice compares best with the Detroit panel because of the enhanced presence of the sitter's face. The head in Memling's painting is proportionally larger than in other works by the artist and claims a similar prominent place within the entire picture. It is also interesting to confront Sittow's portrait with Van Eyck's portrait of Jan de Leeuw of 1436, which most likely remained in Bruges until the 17th century, and therefore must have been accessible to the younger master. In both paintings, Sittow's established eye contact with the beholder. They look out of the painting. But Sittow's understanding of light is quite different, and the absence of the gesticulating hand, an important feature in the Vienna portrait, is interesting. As mentioned before, Van Eyck was interested Sittow because of his realism and perhaps challenged him as a painter. But in contrast to, for example, Gerard David, he didn't seem to have to emulate the entire aspects of Eyckian art in the way that David does it with landscapes, etc., etc. It would be interesting to confront David's work and that of Michel Sittow, but the former reveals his skills as a portraitist almost exclusively in the context of larger altarpieces and epitaphs. With the exception of two somewhat generic portraits of monks, one in Cleveland, and probably executed by members of the studio rather than by the master himself, David's oeuvre as a portraitist is extremely difficult to grasp. The Vienna portrait of a goldsmith that has been traditionally attributed to him has more in common with certain works from Antwerp, and I think you have to think about Quentin Massey's, than with David himself. I think we will briefly return to these pictures in a moment. Another portrait, and it's also illustrated in the catalogue, has been in the past attributed to Michel Sittow because of the headdress bust, has in fact little in common to the painting. This portrait of a man that is in the collection of the Castello Sforzesco in Milan is also, despite its scale, it clearly has a different function and is actually presenting a more formal character. Although there are reminiscences with the oeuvre of the Brussels master of the princely portraits, and I mean especially sort of again the proportions of the lower body and the face. It has been associated with the master of the legend of the Saint Ursula, a Bruges painter active in the 1480s and 19s. This attribution is convincing when compared to the left wing of a devotional diptych in the Antwerp Museum, in the collection of the Antwerp Museum, currently in the Groningen Museum in Bruges, that has been attributed to the same anonymous artist. The attribution to the master of the Ursula legend, however, becomes rather problematic if we are contrasting it, and I can't show you a picture here, with the famous portrait attributed to the master of the Ursula legend of Ludovico Portinari that is in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And that, again, shows quite different features. So it is worthwhile to remember that our understanding of Lembit portraiture is limited and that we know or think we know about a handful of distinct artists. Arguably, the Detroit painting has more in common with this anonymous portrait of a monk from the collection of the Rhode Island School of Design and Providence than stylistically than with the painting attributed to the master of the Ursula legend. But again, they are quite different. Acquired as the work of a Bruges artist, the portrait displays certain affinities with the oeuvre of Hugo van der Goes than with, say, Memling. In the handling of the face, and perhaps more so in the hands, the painter shows an affinity towards monumentality that is usually not typical for the Bruges production, but is also visible in the Detroit portrait. Most likely, the wing of a devotional portrait diptych, it should be dated towards the end of the 15th century and could have been produced in the years after 1500. Our fragmented understanding of the art historical evolution in the Low Countries during the period of 1500 explains the difficulties to come to terms with certain attributions. I already mentioned the Vienna portrait of a goldsmith that is attributed to David, but without much real substance to it. Another interesting portrait, and closely actually related to the goldsmith portrait, is the portrait of King Henry VII from the National Portrait Gallery in London. It has been, of course, attributed to Michel Sittow in the past and served as a stay, as an argument of a short and early stay, however undocumented, at the court of England after his first Spanish sojourn. Henry's portrait, in all likelihood, is one version of an official court portrait which may or may not have been painted by Sittow. Personally, I think there is little doubt about the fact that the inventor of the king's portrait was a painter from the Netherlands, or someone who had worked there, and I personally would again argue that the prototype of the London painting might have been produced by the young Quentin Massey's especially in the light of the fact that our colleagues at the Kimball have recently very convincingly argued that the famous portrait of Jakob Albrecht actually has to be attributed to, dated 1496, has to be attributed to Quentin Massais. It has been argued in favor of an attribution to Sittow that the left hand of the king resting on the parapet shows exactly the same holding and position than the hands of Christian II of Denmark. While this observation is correct, it also applies to many other portraits of 15th century and is shown in reverse in both Memling's Washington Man and the Error, with the Error, as well as the portrait of a man from Venice. No doubt, this very motive was based on pattern drawings that circulated in different workshops and were used universally, even though mirrored. It's a generic motive, one that was apparently expected from the clients and a means to underline the existence of a parapet in a painting. Therefore, not an argument for an attribution. And of course, that brings us to the portrait of Christian II of Denmark, which, as you all know, brings us again into court sphere. Another painting which has a clear formal status as it presents one of the rulers of the period, and as we all know, that goes back then to traditions of proxy paintings. I'm already behind my schedule. Proxy paintings in the Burgundian Netherlands. Since the time is up, I think I made a few points, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.